it's very different. And they have us kind of coming on the scene. In modern, a lot of the modern interpretations of this, they're caught in a weird place because their discoveries keep showing much older development. And so we're at an interesting place as a culture on this. There's no real good solution out there. The National Geographic world sort of lives in a fantasy. But let's think about it as very, everything's being much rearlier. There's a fascinating reading that Casey gives talking about this great meeting of all of the nations on Earth trying to fight off, talks about these great beasts, so these dinosaurs. And he gives the date 50,722 BC. So that technology, that meeting, that communication, worldwide communication broadcast, 50,722 BC, we have Neanderthal, we have all these kind of things in the background, but we don't have any kind of real history to work from. So instantly we're at a huge disadvantage when it comes to that. That's where the mystery traditions kind of fill in a lot of the background and give us a much better idea of what went down there, which I think is so crucial. And, there's a great comment from Graham Hancock talking about how we're a culture with amnesia. It's because there's a huge chapter missing before we get to the Egyptian civilization. But one thing I'll say about the eighth sphere aspect is, it is one of the things that was said there, and that's interesting, is that you exist in it. You have the ability, if you wake up and suck into this imaginative VR reality over time, you are operating inside the eighth sphere. It's funny, I mentioned these NASA projects dealing with Mars, and how I felt, instead of being on Mars, these people seem like they were in the eighth sphere. I'm going to show you a couple of those. And then show you how this artwork contrasts against some artwork that was developed in Steiner's time by Hilma Klimt. And the interesting sort of contrast there gives us a great deal about the sucked out, lifeless nature of the eighth sphere versus, something that has a spiritual core and, inspired artists like Kandinsky and all kinds of fascinating art movements. All right, so some of these, have the kind of basic sort of trolling around on Mars things. And this one in particular I found interesting because it had that kind of eighth sphere signature to it. And again, this is a NASA-sponsored project about life on Mars. In some of these, you can see them sort of trolling around with these eighth sphere type creatures. And the artists Nicholas Kahn and Richard Selznick, and Mars Visions, and previously they had Apollo predictions. I found an incredible corollary with this to the same thing that was going on with Suzanne Treister in the CERN Tarot deck. There's kind of lifeless thing, but it seems incredibly potent in terms of information. It just seems like the goals of what they're talking about have that kind of lifeless, zombified eighth sphere aspect. This one I thought was interesting because it's almost like a Mars eighth sphere Nimza. And we have some interesting shows coming up on Nimza, so this could get interesting. One of the other things that I noticed in the work of these artists who were sponsored by NASA were these strange kind of creatures with these beaks. And they're some sort of astronaut, but they seem to be encountering our astronauts.
That's interesting. It's been reminding me of during the Black Plague.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Excellent point. The last one I'll show in this whole thing is this one, which again gives me that kind of, isn't that like eighth sphere vibe?
Yes.
There is something to it. So for me, the fact that NASA was coming up with this and, the nature of it being, hey, this is life on Mars. Well, if it was that lifeless and anti-human, then it'd be nothing to aspire to there as well.
Right. Here's the question to Jot Madri. Who funded these artists? Any connections to black budgets or the usual characters? I'd like to remind everyone, they used our tax dollars for this.
True. Although,
unnecessary project.
Absolutely. That doesn't even bother me so much.
No, it bothers me.
Because, there's all sorts of artistic interpretations and, somebody out there may have liked what they did. The problem that I had with it was more the goal of the group sponsoring it inside NASA. They were there kind of portraying this very kind of zombified, unhappy existence on Mars. And for me, it was a hint of like, this is the world that you're projecting into in the eighth sphere. Just a quick thing on Hilma Klimt. I want to say this, that her art was so advanced and she came to be originally a follower of Theosophy and then of Rudolf Steiner. But when she met Steiner at the Goetheanum, this very interesting meeting that they have where he says, I don't think you should release your paintings, not for a good 75 years, because they're so advanced for the culture that in a 7,500-year window, that culture will be able to accept them. And in fact, she held a great many of them back from public display. And she's very interesting in her own right, having gone through some personal tragedies. She had a sister that died, and it opened up part of this pondering, philosophically opened her up spiritually to a number of interesting concepts. And she retired in Sweden. And it's only really in the last, say, 10 years that her work has come out so powerfully. And the essence of the higher wisdom breaking through something like the eighth sphere seems to be over and over again a theme in her work.
Oh, magnificent.
And really bringing that forward. We put some of that in the thumbnail as well. But I think the contrast there that we're getting with, this kind of anthroposophical artist versus these weird, lifeless Mars people gives us a hint of what they're talking about when they talk about, how the eighth sphere, how people disappear into the eighth sphere. Now, let's go back now. So we had Sinnott prematurely lets out the eighth sphere information and lets it out incorrectly. Then a couple years later in The Secret Doctrine, Blavatsky tries to clean it up. But there's also problems with Blavatsky and some of the things that she's being given. In particular, this idea, there's a powerful aspect inside the mystery schools that says that Yahweh, who, is there as the kind of God of the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, he has set up the moon, and he has made sure that the moon has a heavy material aspect to it that cannot be sucked in by Ahriman.
Wait, who's done this?
Yahweh.
Okay.
Now, what's interesting is in Theosophy, they try to pack Yahweh in as this moon god and like forget him, that whole thing. So there's a kind of an anti Yahweh and an anti-Christianity thing that creeps in to Theosophy, which wasn't there originally. And this is by design. Now, what's interesting is, in short, what Steiner is saying is that through the different types of clairvoyant imagination that's being sucked out of humanity, it's being helped to develop this eighth sphere. But simultaneous with it is the need to adopt the mineral aspects of the earth to develop it. And so basically, one of the things that in the cosmology Yahweh is being credited for in Steiner's work is really developing the moon as such a realm that Ahriman cannot basically take control of the entire earth, because the moon is a preventative to that. So this is very crucial, and he would have a tremendous advantage if this were not so. So when we get out of this phase, you do see very clearly that Blavatsky kind of spanks Sinnott and expects him to do a huge correction. Instead, he puts out a little more work about the eighth sphere. It contains the same errors about how the eighth sphere is the moon, etc. Now, you and I, not being in the mystery school, may not understand exactly why this is such an important, powerful piece, but let's try here a little bit. And I'm going to do that through quoting C.G. Harrison and what he had to say about it, and then quoting Steiner. And then we'll go to your questions. How does that sound? Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is Eighth Sphere AI Warning, Kona Blue UFO file. Right now, we're going into where the mystery school saw the eighth sphere and the dangers of the artificial intelligence becoming a secondary realm and us projecting our consciousness into this virtual reality without being mind, body, and spirit, which is what we need to spiritually evolve. And really the danger of the interruption of that spiritual evolutionary track, and seeing that kind of taken off with Ahriman and Lucifer guiding us into a false evolutionary track through a false planet, this eighth sphere that's developed. By the way, the eighth sphere isn't something that we can see with a telescope, but it is something, according to the mysteries, that you can see through visionary clairvoyance. So that's the place where it rests, as it were. It's not going to be observable by a telescope. All right.